May 6, 1943. Mid-Atlantic, 3:47 a.m. Oberleutnant Klaus Barsten clung to a piece of splintered decking, his fingers so numb he could no longer feel the wood around him. In the darkness, he heard the screams of his crewmates fading one by one. Some from exhaustion, some from the cold, some simply stopped. 19 hours earlier, U-521 had been a proud Type 1 XCU boat. Now it was 800 FT below him, torn apart by depth charges from an American destroyer escort. Of the 52 men who had scrambled topside as she went down, maybe 20 still lived. Maybe Klaus had been in the Marine for 4 years. He had heard the stories every U-boat man had. The Americans did not take prisoners in the Atlantic. Why would they? You sink their merchant ships, kill their sailors, and they are supposed to fish you out of the ocean. The standing orders from U-boat command were clear. If captured, expect nothing. The Americans would leave you to drown or worse, machine gun you in the water. That is what happened to the crew of U-352 last year. That is what happened to U-85. That is what Klaus had been told would happen to him. He had seen what his own Navy did to survivors sometimes in this war. In this ocean, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. And after 4 years of unrestricted submarine warfare, after all the Allied sailors they had sent to the bottom without a second thought, Klaus knew he deserved nothing. The propaganda officer in Laurent had shown them photos of American war crimes. U-boat men supposedly shot in the water left to die on rafts. Whether the photos were real or not, Klaus had believed them. Every submariner believed them. It made sense. This was total war. This was the Atlantic where the rules did not apply. So when Klaus heard the engines in the darkness, that deep rumble of a destroyer screws, his first thought was not hope. It was terror. They are coming back. Someone gasped in German beside him. They are coming back to finish us. Klaus could not even pray. His Lutheran mother would have told him to. But what could he say? God forgive me for the ships I have sunk, for the men I have killed. No, if this was his end, he had earned it. The engine noise grew louder, closer. A searchlight suddenly blazed across the water, blinding white, sweeping across the oil-slicked waves. Klaus closed his eyes. This was how it ended. Not in glory, not in combat, but like rats in the water, waiting for the extermination to begin. But what happened next would change everything Klaus Barsten thought about Americans. The searchlight found them. Klaus squinted against the glare, his salt-burned eyes barely able to focus. The destroyer loomed above them, USS Bory. He would later learn her gray hull massive and unstoppable. Men lined the rails looking down. This was it. Klaus thought about his sister in Hamburg, hoped she would never know how he died. Then he heard something impossible. Grab the lines. We are throwing lines. English, American English, but not shouted in anger, shouted in urgency. Rope splashed into the water around them. Heavy cargo nets unfurled down the destroyer's side. Klaus stared at them, his exhausted mind unable to process what he was seeing. A trap. Were they supposed to climb up so the Americans could shoot them on deck instead of wasting ammunition in the water? Come on, move it. Get out of that water. One of Klaus's crew mates, mechanic Matt Verrer, called. A kid barely 20 started crying, not from fear, from confusion. What are they doing? Verrer sobbed in German. What are they doing? I do not know, Klaus whispered back. An American sailor, young, maybe younger than Verrer, was climbing down the cargo net down into the water toward them. He had a life ring, and he was shouting something Klaus could not understand through the wind and engine noise. The sailor reached the water line, waves washing over him, and grabbed the nearest German Maschinen Matt Friedrich, unconscious and barely breathing. The American did not hesitate. He secured the life ring around Friedrich, shouted up to the deck, and they hauled him up. Then the American sailor looked directly at Klaus. Can you climb? Klaus understood enough English to nod. Then climb before you freeze to death. The sailor's face was not cruel, was not mocking. He looked in concerned, almost angry, but not at Klaus. Angry at the ocean, at the cold, at the fact that men were dying. Klaus grabbed the net. His hands would not close properly. The rope felt like glass against his frozen palms. He got one foot up, then another, then slipped. Strong hands caught him from above American hands and hauled him bodily up the side of the destroyer. He collapsed on the deck, shaking uncontrollably, expecting boots or rifle butts, expecting the end. Instead, someone threw a wool blanket over him. Heavy, warm, it smelled like diesel and tobacco. An American voice, "Get him to the wardroom, Doc. We got another one." Klaus looked up. A ring of American sailors surrounded him, but they were not pointing guns. One was cutting away his soaked uniform jacket with a knife, not to humiliate him but to get the wet cloth off. Another was wrapping his feet in dry cloth. A third pressed a metal cup to his lips, coffee black and bitter and scalding hot. Klaus choked on it, coughed, and the sailor with the cup actually smiled. "Easy, buddy, easy. You are okay now, okay." Klaus was a prisoner. He was the enemy. He had spent 4 years trying to sink American ships, and this sailor was telling him he was okay. They carried him below decks. The last thing Klaus saw before they took him down was the cargo nets still hanging over the side. More Germans being pulled from the water. Americans climbing down to help. The destroyer's captain on the bridge wing watching it all. Later, Klaus would learn that captain's name, Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchkins, and he would learn that Hutchkins had just violated direct orders from convoy command. The standing order was clear. Do not stop for U-boat survivors. Do not risk your ship. The convoy was behind schedule. U-boat were still in the area and stopping made Bori a stationary target. But Hutchkins had looked at those men in the water, enemy or not, and made a choice. He had keyed the ship's intercom and said 5 words that would define his career. "We are going back for them." His executive officer had quietly reminded him of the orders. Hutchkins had replied, "Noted, prepare rescue stations." On that deck, shaking under a Navy blanket, Klaus did not know any of this yet. He only knew one thing. He was still alive and nothing made sense anymore. The wardroom of USS Bori had been converted into an emergency aid station. Klaus was laid on a bench, still wrapped in blankets, while a Navy pharmacist's mate, the Americans called him Doc, though he was maybe 25, examined him with quick professional efficiency. Hypothermia, exhaustion, some saltwater aspiration. Doc muttered to a sailor, taking notes. "But he will live. Get his core temperature up. Warm water, not hot. And for God's sake, someone find dry clothes that will fit him." Klaus understood perhaps half the words, but the meaning was clear. They were treating him, actually treating him. Not just keeping him alive for interrogation later, but treating him like he mattered. Another pharmacist mate was working on Vurer Koal 2 benches over. Vurer's feet were a disturbing shade of blue-white. Doc glanced over, frowned, and called out, "How is the kid?" "Possible frostbite on the toes. He will need to see a real doctor when we make port. Mark him priority for medical transfer when we dock." Klaus watched this exchange in disbelief. Priority medical transfer for a German U-boat man. Vurer had probably helped sink a dozen ships, and they were worried about his toes. A sailor appeared with a bundle of clothes. Dungaree trousers, a thick navy pullover sweater, wool socks, all used, all clean. "Best I could do, Doc. He is a big guy, good enough. Help him change." The sailor helped Klaus sit up, helped him pull off his soaked undershirt, helped him dress like he was a child or an invalid. But there was no mockery in it, no cruelty, just efficiency, maybe even kindness. When Klaus was dressed, the sailor pressed another cup of coffee into his hands and said something in English that Klaus did not catch. The sailor saw his confusion and tried again slowly. "You are safe. Safe. Understand. Safe." Klaus's voice cracked when he tried to respond. "Dank, thank you." The sailor grinned. "See, we are getting somewhere." Over the next 6 hours, as Bori rejoined the convoy and steamed toward Newfoundland, something remarkable happened in that wardroom. Men who had been trying to kill each other became briefly just men. The Americans brought food, not prisoner rations, not punishment GR, but actual food from the crew's own mess. White bread with butter, canned beef stew, peaches, and syrup, more coffee than Klaus could drink. Friedrich, who had regained consciousness, started crying when he tasted the peaches. He had not had fruit in 8 months. Petty Officer James McKinley from South Boston appointed himself unofficial translator. His German was terrible. Learned from grandparents who had immigrated in 1910, but he tried. He sat with Klaus and the other survivors, asking questions, answering questions, bridging the impossible gap between enemies. "Where are you from?" McKinley asked Klaus in broken German. Klaus replied, "Yeah, my grandparents came from Hamburg, that close, close enough." "Do you have family there?" Klaus hesitated. Was this intelligence gathering? But McKinley's face was open, genuinely curious. A sister, Greta. McKinley pulled out his wallet, showed Klaus a photo. A woman and two small children. My wife and my kids, Jimmy and Catherine, have not seen them in 14 months. Klaus stared at the photo. McKinley had a family. Of course he did. Why had Klaus never thought about that? All those merchant ships U-521 had torpedoed. They had all had photos like this in their wallets. Men with wives, children, sisters. I am sorry, Klaus said quietly in English. McKinley looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Yeah, me too. Hell of a war, is it not? Another sailor, Seaman Rodriguez from Texas, brought his harmonica and started playing. Nothing martial, nothing patriotic, just folk songs, melodies that needed no translation. One of the German survivors, Obrinistan Matchman, who had been a church organist before the war, began humming along, then singing softly in German. Nobody stopped him. The Americans did not have many German speakers, but they found ways to communicate: pictures, gestures, shared cigarettes, lucky strikes, and whatever German tobacco the survivors had managed to keep dry. An Ihnen who had studied chemistry at MIT and a German engineer spent 20 minutes drawing diagrams on a notepad, comparing diesel engine designs, finding common technical ground. Lieutenant Commander Hutchkins came down to the wardroom once, walked among the survivors, and spoke briefly with Doc. Klaus could not hear what was said, but he saw Hutchkins look at each German, making some kind of assessment, not hostile, more like checking on them, making sure they were being treated properly. When Hutchkins left, Doc told the assembled Americans, "Captain says, well done. He is proud of this crew. Proud for rescuing enemy submariners." On the second day, as Bory steamed into St. John's Harbor, Newfoundland, McKinley sat with Klaus again. By now, they had developed enough rapport for difficult conversations. "You know what you are going to tell the intelligence officers, right?" McKinley asked. "Name, rank, serial number. That is all you have to say." Klaus nodded. Geneva Convention, he knew it by heart. "They are going to treat you decently," McKinley continued. "I mean it. You will go to a POW camp, probably in the States or Canada. It is not going to be the Ritz, but it will be clean food, medical care, male privileges after a while. Hell, some camps have sports leagues." Klaus must have looked skeptical because McKinley laughed. "I know, sounds like, but I have a cousin who is a guard at a camp in Montana. He says the German prisoners got it better than he did growing up in Dorchester." "Why?" Klaus asked. It was the question that had been burning in him for 2 days. "Why do this? We are enemies. We tried to kill you." McKinley was quiet for a while. "Then you know what my CEO told us before we went back for you guys," he said. "Someday this war is going to end. And on that day I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror. That is why." But there was more to it than one captain's conscience. As Klaus would later learn, American treatment of PS was systematic, not accidental. It flowed from the top down. General Eisenhower had made it clear to every American commander. Geneva Convention compliance was not optional. It was not subject to mood or circumstance or revenge. It was policy. American soldiers were taught that PSWs had rights, that they were to be fed the same rations as American troops, that they were to receive medical care, that they were human beings who had surrendered and therefore deserved specific codified treatment. This was not altruism. It was strategic. Every German who surrendered and received decent treatment was another data point against Nazi propaganda. Every P who went home after the war and said, "The Americans treated me fairly," was a seed for future peace. But sitting in that wardroom, watching American sailors share their cigarettes and their harmonica music, Klaus understood something deeper. Policy came from somewhere. Someone had decided that even in total war, even against the U-boat that were starving Britain, even against men who had shown no mercy to merchant sailors, even then there were rules. There were lines you did not cross. 3 moments stayed with Klaus Barston for the rest of his life. On that first night, shaking with cold and shock, Klaus had fouled himself. The fear, the hypothermia, the hours in the water, his body had simply quit. He was mortified. Here he was, the enemy. And now he was lying in his own filth on an American warship. The sailor who discovered it, Seaman Second as Robert Chen, A Chinese-American kid from San Francisco did not laugh, did not mock, did not even look disgusted. He just said, "Hey doc, we need clean skiabas and a wash basin over here." Then Talos gently, "It is okay, man, happens to everybody, let us get you cleaned up." Chen helped him wash, helped him into clean, borrowed underwear, disposed of the soiled clothes without comment. When Klaus tried to apologize, Chen just shook his head. "Brother, you spent 19 hours in the North Atlantic. You got nothing to apologize for." That moment of dignity when Klaus had none, he never forgot it. On the third day at the P Processing Center in Newfoundland, an American Red Cross worker approached Klaus. She was maybe 50. Gray hair, kind eyes. "The camp commander has authorized you to write one letter home," she said in careful German. "One page. It will be censored, but it will be sent through the International Red Cross. Your family will know you are alive." Klaus had not cried since he was a boy. But sitting there with that single piece of paper, pen in hand, thinking about Greta in Hamburg who thought he was dead, he broke. The Red Cross worker tactfully busied herself with paperwork until he composed himself. He wrote to his sister, "Greta, I am alive. I am a prisoner, but I am unhurt and being treated well. They give us enough to eat. Do not worry for me. Please tell mother I will come home when this war ends. Your brother Klaus." Simple words. But that letter reached Hamburg 4 months later, and Greta kept it until she died in 1987. Klaus knew this because when he visited her after the war, she showed it to him yellowed and creased from being read 1,000 times. That letter was not required by the Geneva Convention for 4 more weeks. But some American commander had decided to allow it early because somewhere an enemy family was grieving, and that could be alleviated. The day Klaus transferred from the processing center to a permanent P camp in Virginia, Lieutenant Commander Hutchkins appeared. Klaus had never spoken directly to the man who had saved his life. Hutchkins found Klaus in the group of prisoners waiting for the transport truck. Through an interpreter, he said, "I wanted to see you before you shipped out. I wanted to make sure you understood something." Klaus stood straight at attention despite being a prisoner. "We did not rescue you because we like you boats," Hutchkins said. "We do not. You sank a lot of good ships, killed a lot of good men, but you are a sailor and you were in the water, and that is enough. When this war is over, you are going to go home. And when you do, I want you to remember that Americans play by the rules, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard." Then Hutchkins extended his hand. Klaus stared at it. Officers did not shake hands with enlisted prisoners. Captains did not shake hands with enemy submariners, but Hutchkins's hand stayed out steady, waiting. Klaus took it. "Good luck, sailor," Hutchkins said. Klaus managed to reply, "Thank you, Captain, for my life." Hutchkins nodded once and walked away. Klaus never saw him again. But 60 years later, in a German television interview, Klaus would say, "That handshake meant more to me than you can imagine. He could have left us in the water. No one would have blamed him. But he came back and then he shook my hand like I was a human being. That was America to me. That handshake, why Americans behaved this way." The treatment Klaus received was not unusual. It was policy, culture, and character all working together. American military doctrine on P treatment came from multiple sources. The practical, well-treated prisoners were more likely to surrender, shortening the war. The legal, the United States had signed the Geneva Convention and took its obligations seriously. And the cultural Americans, for all their flaws, genuinely believed in fair play. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, had issued clear guidance. The American soldier will treat prisoners with firmness, but also with respect due to defeated enemies who have surrendered honorably. Eisenhower reinforced this in Europe. Even Admiral King, known for his hatred of U-boat, supported proper treatment of survivors once they were captured. This was not universal. Atrocities happened especially in the Pacific where racism and mutual brutality created a different kind of war. But in the Atlantic and Europe, American P treatment was remarkably consistent. German prisoners in American camps had mortality rates under 1%. Compare that to American PWs in German camps, 3 to 4% mortality. In Japanese camps, over 27%. The cultural component mattered enormously. Most American servicemen came from communities where sportsmanship mattered, where you helped the losing team off the field, where kicking a man when he is down was dishonorable. They had grown up with referees and rules, and the idea that even in competition there were boundaries. Many American servicemen were also children or grandchildren of immigrants. McKinley's German grandparents, Rodriguez's Mexican heritage, Chen's Chinese parents. They understood that nationality was often an accident of birth, not a moral choice. The German in the water could have been their grandfather if history had turned differently. And there was self-interest, carefully unspoken. Treat enemy PS well, and maybe the enemy would treat your PS well. It did not always work. Nazi camps were brutal, Japanese camps horrific, but the principle held. Americans took the moral high ground partly because it was right and partly because they hoped it would protect their own. For Klaus and the other survivors of U-521, American captivity was a systematic dismantling of everything they had been told about the enemy. The propaganda had been specific. Americans were soft, undisciplined mongrel people with no culture and no honor. They were gangsters and cowboys who had tortured prisoners for sport. They were controlled by Jews who wanted to exterminate the German race. But the reality was different at every level. Camp Lee, Virginia, where Klaus spent most of his captivity, was a revelation. The barracks were clean. The food was adequate, not luxurious, but sufficient. The guards were professional, neither cruel nor overly familiar. There was a library with books in German. There was a sports field where prisoners organized soccer leagues. There was a canteen where they could buy tobacco and sundries with script earned from camp labor. One day, about 6 months into his captivity, Klaus was working in the camp. Vegetable garden prisoners did agricultural labor for pay when the guard supervising them sat down in the shade and lit a cigarette. After a moment, he offered the pack around. Klaus took one. The guard, a corporal from Iowa named Miller, made conversation in slow English that Klaus mostly followed. "Now, do you grow vegetables back home?" "No, I was in university engineering." "No kidding." "What kind?" "Naval architecture," Miller laughed. "So you designed the boats that were trying to sink us?" "That is funny." "I suppose it is," Klaus admitted. They smoked in companionable silence. Then Miller said, "This war has got to end sometime. What will you do?" Klaus had been thinking about this a lot. "Go home, help rebuild. We destroyed so much." "Yeah," Miller drew on his cigarette. "My dad fought in the last war, France. He said the worst part was coming home and realizing it did not have to happen at all. All those guys dead for nothing." It was the most subversive thing Klaus had heard. Not from another prisoner, from an American guard. "Do you think this war was for nothing?" Klaus asked carefully. "Hell no. Hitler needed stopping. But afterward, when you go home, do not let it happen again. That is all I am saying." That conversation and 1,000 others like it did more to deprogram Klaus than any lecture could have. These Americans were not monsters. They were not stupid. They believed they had fought a just war against an unjust regime. And now that the fighting was done, they wanted to move forward. Klaus Barston was one of approximately 380,000 German PS held in the United States during World War II. The vast majority, over 370,000, survived to go home. By contrast, of the roughly 93,000 Americans captured by Germany, about 1% died in captivity. Of the 27,000 Americans captured by Japan, over 27% died. The disparity was not accidental. It was the result of systematic policy differences. German PS in America worked on farms, in food processing plants, in forestry. They were paid for their labor. They received the same medical care as American soldiers. Red Cross inspectors regularly visited the camps and found conditions generally satisfactory. Some camps were so pleasant that German prisoners called them golden cages. Camp Co, Mississippi, Camp Hearn, Texas. Camps where prisoners formed orchestras, published camp newspapers in German, attended educational classes preparing for post-war life. This generosity had strategic benefits. Well-treated PS did not try to escape as much. They provided intelligence more readily. And when they went home after the war, they became informal ambassadors for American values. Klaus himself would write in his 1982 memoir, "I went into American captivity expecting death or brutality. I found neither. I found men who even in war believed in rules and fairness. This was my first real encounter with democracy, not the word but the practice of it. What happened to Klaus Barston? Klaus returned to Germany in January 1946, one of the later repatriations. He arrived in Bremerhaven on a transport ship, processed through with thousands of other former prisoners, and took a train to Hamburg. The city was ruins. Greta was still alive, living in the basement of what had been their apartment building. But both parents were dead, his father in a bombing raid, his mother from starvation the winter before. Klaus found work clearing rubble for ration cards, then slowly, painfully, began rebuilding his life. He used his engineering training to get a position with the Port Authority, helping restore Hamburg's docks. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent years trying to destroy shipping. Now he was rebuilding it. In 1949, Klaus did something unexpected. He wrote a letter to Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins, care of the U.S. Navy. He did not know if Hutchins was still in the service or even alive, but he wrote anyway. The letter said simply, "Captain Hutchins, you saved my life in May 1943. Though I was your enemy, I want you to know that I have thought of you often. I have tried to live in a way that honors the mercy you showed. Thank you for teaching me that humanity can survive even in war. Klaus Barston." 3 months later, he received a reply. Hutchins had left the Navy in 1946, was now a civilian engineer in Rhode Island. His letter was warm. "Mr. Barston, I am glad to hear you made it home safely. I am glad to hear you are rebuilding. That is all any of us can do. Build something better than what we tore down. Best wishes, Charles Hutchins." They corresponded occasionally over the years. In 1961, when Klaus had saved enough money, he traveled to America for the first time since his captivity. He visited Hutchins in Rhode Island. They spent an afternoon together, two old sailors, drinking coffee, talking about everything except the war. Klaus asked the question that had haunted him. "Why did you come back for us? You risked your ship, your career." Hutchins thought for a long time. "You know what my father told me when I was a kid?" He said, "The measure of a man is what he does when nobody is watching, and nobody would blame him for doing less. I came back because I had to be able to look at myself afterward." Klaus married in 1954 a war widow named Helga who had lost her first husband at Stalingrad. They had 2 children. Klaus told them about his war experiences, including his capture. He emphasized one lesson. Even in the worst circumstances, even when it would be easier to be cruel, some people choose humanity. That choice is what civilization means. He never went back to sea. He could not bear it. But he worked in Hamburg's maritime industry until retirement, helped train a generation of German engineers, and lived to see his country rebuilt into a democracy. When Klaus died in 1998 at age 79, his funeral was small. But among the attendees was someone unexpected. Hutchins's son Mark, who had come from America to pay respects. He brought a photo his father had kept, a picture of USS Boar's crew from 1943. And on the back, in Hutchins's handwriting, "The day we remembered we were human beings first, sailors second." Klaus Barston's story multiplied across thousands of German, Italian, and Japanese prisoners. Each one was a data point against Axis propaganda. Each one was a seed for post-war reconstruction. When the Marshall Plan was proposed in 1947, billions of dollars to rebuild Europe, including former enemies, it was not a hard sell to the American public. Why? Partly because millions of American servicemen had seen that Germans and Italians were just people. They had guarded POW camps. They had worked alongside prisoners in fields and factories. They had shared cigarettes in stories and found common humanity. The treatment of PS made Germany and Italy easier to befriend after the war, made the transformation to democracy more palatable, made NATO possible, made the European Union imaginable. This was not inevitable. After World War I, harsh treatment of Germany had bred resentment and contributed to World War II. After World War II, America chose differently, and men like Klaus, men who had experienced American fairness firsthand, became advocates for democracy and Atlantic partnership. Klaus himself joined the German-American Friendship Society in Hamburg in the 1960s, helped arrange student exchanges, worked to strengthen transatlantic ties. He gave talks to German youth groups about his war experiences, always emphasizing, "I learned about democracy from my enemies, not my own government." That tells you something. The strategic wisdom of proper P treatment paid dividends for generations. Germany became America's strongest European ally. Japan became a Pacific partner. Italy rebuilt as a democracy. And throughout the Cold War, when the stakes were existential, these former enemies stood with America. All because during the war, someone had decided that even enemies deserve treatment according to rules, that humanity was not suspended during conflict, that how you won mattered almost as much as that you won. In 1993, on the 50th anniversary of his rescue, Klaus gave an interview to a German television network. He was quiet for a long time. This old man who had once been a young submariner clinging to wreckage certain he was about to die. Then he said, "When you are in the water and you think you are going to die, you understand that life is a gift. Every moment afterward is borrowed time. But when someone saves you when they did not have to, when you were their enemy, when they had every reason to leave you, that is a different kind of gift. That is a lesson about what humans can be." I spent 4 years in the Marine believing propaganda about Americans, mongrels, cowards, barbarians. Then I spent 19 hours in the water expecting them to murder me, and instead they pulled me out. They gave me coffee and blankets. They treated my frostbite. They let me write to my sister. That Captain Hutchkins, he risked a court-martial for me, for us, for men who had been trying to kill.